Hi, and welcome to the second lesson. The focus of this lesson is the language of art and architecture. So as you can see on the screen, we have two very different paintings. One is from the Renaissance again. So this one you can see is called The Dead Christ, or Cristo Morto, and you can see that he is laying away from us. So we'll talk about the technique of foreshortening. We'll think about textures that are represented here, ideas of space. So what are some of the words we can use to describe these representations, to describe these paintings? If we look on the right-hand side, we see a 20th century work by a painter who's been associated with surrealism, kind of this dreamlike or sometimes nightmare-like imagery. And so here you can see plays with perspective and also plays with how space is represented more generally. Also ideas of shadow and representations of architecture. So the next part of this lesson is to think about architecture and ways of describing architecture. So we'll start with more art, and then you'll see in the second part it's more about architecture. So the goal of the lesson for this week is to really become very comfortable with describing the form of art. And so we would call this formal elements. So I always say it's not like formal, let's go put on our tuxedo. It's formal, thinking about the form of the art. So what's the medium, what's it made of, the technique, the proportion or scale, the composition, space, color, line, texture, light, and shape, and volume. So if it's a 3D work, thinking about volume. So all of these are important to consider. So we start off with very basic elements, line. So when we think of line, we might immediately think of drawing. So we're going to see some drawing, but also we could think about examples of painting where line is evident, or sculpture where you have a sense of line coming through the sculpture. You might even, you can have architecture that employs line to help organize space and structures. So here we have different types of line: flowing, meandering, calligraphic, and jagged. And when I'm in the in-person class, we often talk about how these different lines make you feel, or like the impression that they give the viewer. So the one that's jagged, maybe it has this harder edge, maybe a sense of nervous energy or anger. Calligraphic looks very beautiful and controlled, but also has this flowing quality to it, a kind of calmness and control that's reassuring. Again, kind of a nervousness with meandering, and a more kind of go with the flow, flowing line here, where it's perhaps a bit more wild and outside the lines, but still has a kind of calmness to it. So just thinking about different elements of line. So here are two different drawings that help us to understand how line can really be the basis of the creation of form. And also, of course, line was very important for artists in terms of drawing. If you're an artist yourself, or if you know someone who's an artist, often they might have a goal of doing a certain number of sketches per day. Or if you're in a drawing class, your instructor might ask you to create a certain number of sketches per day. So here we can see a work by Picasso very early in his career, a few years before the Demoiselles d'Avignon, where you can see he's working out his Saltimbanque series. And so you can see these vertical lines. He's an extraordinary artist in terms of realism, or like naturalistic representations of figures. And then, of course, he will move into more modernism and cubism very shortly after this. And then we have a study for an angel in the Madonna of the Rocks. This is a work by Leonardo da Vinci. Just an extraordinary drawing where you have this use of hatching. We'll talk about that in just a second. But these parallel lines that are very tight and pull together and then become more loose as you move away. We can even think about line in painting or ink. So we have this splashed ink painting from Japan, so a Japanese tradition of what's called Zen painting. And so you can see this one is by Sesshu. And you have just this indication of a flag, or like a flagpole with banner, a small structure, indication of mountain and mist in the distance, and a tree in the foreground. So very different types of representation that are possible. This is a more local artist who represents scenes around LA. And so she represents Hilary Pekis. And so you can see she represents a house in this particular case. You can even see the plants that are a part of it, the kind of California landscape that we see here, the signs of religious devotion that are incorporated. But she's incorporating line into her painting. So elements like the pots and the angular quality of the house. So this idea of including that into the painting. We have what are called gesture lines, and gesture lines tend to be a little bit more quick. And so this idea of maybe if you had a subject that is in motion, that's moving around, like a baby, like a mom holding her baby. So you might have a baby moving around, and so you want to catch different poses. So here you can see the baby kind of turning away, looking up at its mother very sweetly, this kind of nice moment of connection, and then looking away from its mother but still holding on to her. So this would be very useful for an artist. This is by Raphael. This would be very useful for an artist because artists in the Renaissance were often making images of the Virgin Mary with the Christ child. And so these were big money makers for artists. They were very popular. And so having these very naturalistic kind of connections between mother and child were very important. So using these quick gesture lines are key. And there you can see the gesture lines of a foot. And then we have what it's called hatching. So we mentioned that briefly just a minute ago, but this idea of using parallel lines to create tones or values. So this idea of kind of shades of gray or going into black and then into white or very light gray to give you that sense of dimension. Like how do you make a two-dimensional image look three-dimensional? So you can use these layers of hatching. So if you do layers, that's the cross hatching. If you're just using the parallel lines going in one direction, then that would be just hatching. So this, we have a nice hatching technique here. You have a bit moving maybe in the other direction, but that could just be a neck fold there. A nice example of hatching we can see in the 100 Guilder print. Here, I can scooch this over. I'm not sure what's happening there. The 100 Guilder print. So this is a print by Rembrandt. Rembrandt was a very important Dutch Golden Age painter. And he was very, very good at creating light. Light was what he was very, very famous for. And so he did this in paintings, but he also did it in print. And so this was a print he created with Jesus at center, and he's preaching, and the idea that the word of Jesus is spreading amongst the crowd, and those who are accepting the word, those who are understanding the word, are bathed in this light, this idea of this bright light that he's emanating. You can really get the sense of the light emanating from the head of Jesus. And then you have individuals in the darkness, this kind of tunnel along the side. And it was called the 100 Guilder print because it sold for 100 guilders. It sold for a good amount of money, which was a lot for a print because prints could be made in multiples. So Rembrandt made beautiful images of light in painting, so single examples, but he also made prints, and prints were made in multiple. And with the prints, you can see when he would create the etchings, he would use a great deal of hatching and cross hatching. So this is a section kind of just above here where you can see how he's using the hatching to give you that effect of light and dark. We can also see some shading and modeling. So shading and modeling creates this effect of light and dark. So we have this effect of light and dark. So shading or modeling, again, creates this dimension, just like we saw with hatching. So you can see that you have this use of shading, and then even the application of white chalk to create kind of hints of highlight on the form. And so you can just see a little bit of that white there. So this is a martyrdom scene. There were a lot of representations of saints who died for their beliefs, and so this was called martyrdom. So this is called the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. It dates to the 16th century, again in Italy. There's also a particular term called chiaroscuro. So you can say it chiaroscuro, or essentially it's just light and dark. So like claro, it's like light and then dark. So chiaroscuro was a technique used by Italian Renaissance painters, and then it starts spreading around to others. But this idea of creating, again, a sense of dimension by having these highlights and then these areas of darkness. So you can see, for example, on the arm of the Christ child, on his face, on the chest and neck here. You have these areas that are really pushing forward in the composition, whereas you have other areas that are deeply in shadow. And it creates this play of light and dark that gives a sense of dimension. This is a painting by Leonardo da Vinci again, so we've already seen his study for the angel, but this is called The Virgin and Child with St. Anne. And so this is supposed to be Jesus, so the Christ child, and then you have the Virgin Mary and his mother, his earthly mother, and then you have her mother, Saint Anne. So you have kind of this idea of the grandmother of Jesus, the mother of Jesus, and then Jesus, and the idea that Jesus is grabbing onto the lamb, and this is the idea of the sacrificial lamb. So the idea that Jesus will be sacrificed eventually on the cross, according to Christian belief. This idea that he is going to give his life for others, for salvation for others. And so you have him grabbing onto the lamb and his mother's trying to pull him back. So that's what's happening in this kind of twisting and turning scene. As we zoom in, you can just see a bit more of the detail. Oh, sorry, I'll get rid of this so you can see it a little bit better. But you can just see some of those highlights on the wool of the lamb. You can see the individual curls that Leonardo has represented. Again, that idea of light and then dark. And what's interesting is that chiaroscuro was very popular in Europe, but in other cultures, they really felt like this kind of looked a bit dirty to have these deep shadows. So it is interesting that in Europe, they found this to be very beautiful. But when European artists would go over to other places like to China and sometimes work for individuals in power, like including the emperors would find this style to look quite dirty. And so they would always want their paintings to look much brighter and lighter. And they would really want to avoid this deep chiaroscuro. I also wanted to just point out the idea of color theory, or the idea of placing colors right next to one another. So if you place colors right next to each other, you can create these different visual effects. So at the top, you have these 3 small center squares appear to be different shades of orange, but they're all the same. So it's really based on what they're placed next to. And then you have the 2 small pink squares that appear to be the same, but they're actually different, again, based on what they're next to. All right. We also want to think about texture. So texture is this surface characteristic that is tactile or visual. So you could have actual texture, as we see with the Chauri bearer from the Mauryan period in India. So this was a period where it's often called the Mauryan polish, this very, very beautiful high shine polish that we see on sculpture. This is very early sculpture, so 3rd to 2nd century BCE. This is sometimes also called the Diderganj Yakshi. So a Yakshi was a fertility figure. So obviously we're seeing a figure with this rich texture, so we can see things like what look like chains hanging from her hips, a beaded or pearl necklace around her neck. We can see a lot of texture in her hair, in the fly whisk, in the chauri that she's holding, in the kind of gauzy fabric that wraps around her body and also hangs down her legs. You also get the sense that if she were to move, you would get this sense of music, that you would get the sense of the beads moving and making a kind of sound, a musical sound. So there have been different interpretations as to who she is. Again, she could be a fertility figure because she obviously has a very curvaceous figure. She seems to be kind of in the prime of her life. She has a soft belly. You can see the kind of softness to her belly here. And then you can also see, of course, she has very exaggerated breasts. So she seems to be this kind of ideal of fertility. And we see this in a lot of cultures, where cultures early on especially have these ideals of fertility with women with exaggerated body features. So very small waist, very large breasts, and seems again to be kind of in the prime of her fertile life. Other people have suggested that maybe she's more of a courtesan or a courtly figure for the Mauryan court, because she is not entirely nude. So it was much more typical for a Yakshi to be more fully nude. This one is more clothed and has some signs of being perhaps a courtly figure. So just a reminder that this is in India. It was around the time of Ashoka, the ruler, and it's roughly life size, about 5'4", and it's a very important work of sculpture. There's another work that's associated with the reign of Ashoka that's also very important. It dates to 250, and this is the lion capital, which was erected to honor the Buddha. And so this is connected to the first kind of widespread movement of Buddhism moving through India. So these were important column capitals and columns that were erected to honor the Buddha. around India. But back to the Chauri bearer, you can see both of them have some nice texture. Here I'm comparing her to a Yakshi, a figure that we know is a Yakshi, and you can see this Yakshi is more nude, right? She doesn't have kind of that adornment of cloth around her. She does have some adornment around her hips. She has some bracelets and anklets that are similar. So it is possible that it is a Yakshi. We just don't know 100% for sure. So this is very physical type of texture that we're seeing here under the time of Ashoka. But we can also see representations of texture in painting. So we were looking at Mantegna's Dead Christ at the beginning of the lecture, just in that first slide. But here I asked the question, what illusions of texture did Mantegna paint in this image? So maybe take a minute, kind of have a look at what you see. And so what students often respond is they definitely get the sense of the sheet, kind of the cloth that covers his body. We could call it a burial shroud. So this is the idea that Jesus has just been crucified. It's a Christian image, and his body has been placed inside his tomb, and women are coming to mourn him. So you have the Virgin Mary and probably St. John. So it's probably a man and a woman. So anyways, in any case, you have the burial shroud. People often respond to the signs of his crucifixion. So sometimes we see Jesus very, very bloodied after the crucifixion. Here, there's less emphasis on the blood, but there's certainly this invitation to contemplate his suffering and to contemplate his wounds. So you can see that the hands are kind of tilted towards us so that we can really see those wounds. And his feet are really in our face so that we can see the wounds in his feet. And then he also had a fifth wound in his side, and we can just see that one. It's not as obvious. It's said that Mantegna made his feet a bit smaller so that you could see his body and that the feet wouldn't be as distracting. So the flesh, kind of the textures of the flesh, are something to point out. We can also see the stone that he lies on, right? The stone has kind of a coldness and angular quality to it. You can see the kind of texture of the material. This is probably meant to be kind of like an ointment or like a kind of liquid that was being brought to anoint, that's the term, anoint his body after he had died. And you have also just the sense of the texture of the skin of the Virgin Mary, the idea that she's crying and that she's suffering, the texture of his beard, of Jesus's beard and his hair. So lots of texture here. And so we have this difference between literal sculpted texture and then painted texture, this idea of what's represented. We can also think about texture in this painting by a French artist whose last name was Ingres. So it's Ingres. And so you can see that you have wonderful texture that really invites you into the scene. So this plays on a long tradition of reclining nude women that's very popular in European art. There is a tradition of objectifying the female form in European art. And so these reclining, or what were sometimes called supine nudes, were part of this tradition. So we have this reclining female nude. We can just see the side of her breast and a little bit of her buttocks, and then we can see her legs and feet. But again, lots of textures in addition to her smooth skin. It's very, very smooth skin. So you have satiny textures, gemstones, feathers, the satin and embroidery of the curtain. You have smoke coming from this pipe over here. You have more gems in her hair, velvet of the bed that she's lying on. So it's kind of just this layers and layers of texture. And this artist would paint in a way where you could barely see any of the brush strokes. Thinking about shape and volume. So shape is a 2D entity. So here I have a painting by Mondrian from the 20th century, where you just see how he is reducing painting to these basic elements of primary colors and geometric forms. And then I'm back to the Chauri bearer or the Didurgan Yakshi, and you can just see how this one is very much three-dimensional. You could walk around it. All right, let's move on to space and illusions of space. So we're going to go through this relatively quickly. There are lots of wonderful videos, which I'll link in the site, about understanding more of the the techniques of perspective, but we'll go through some of them together. So Space and Illusions of Space. So this is by Giorgio de Chirico. This is called Melancholy and Mystery of a Street. I talked a little bit about dream or nightmare imagery. This one's from the early 20th century. Remember that in the early 20th century, there's this movement towards modernism, this kind of questioning of what painting's going to be. We have movements like Cubism, where forms are being fragmented. And here we have an artist who's really playing with space and kind of playing with our psychology in a way. So you can see that the building extends on for a very long time, a surprising amount of time, and nothing really aligns quite properly. We can think about space back to the Dead Christ painting from 1490 by Mantegna. And this is called foreshortening, this idea. And this was very challenging. So if you try to draw a foreshortened figure, it takes some skill. So this idea of tilting a figure back, kind of tilting them back into space. So we see artists doing this with the human form, sometimes with animals. And it's much more challenging than just, if you're a child and you're drawing, usually you're representing things in kind of straight and frontal. And so as you become a better artist, you can do this foreshortening where the figure tips back into the picture plane. So here you can just see the title, the Dead Christ. Here I'm showing you foreshortening in the Sistine Chapel. We'll talk about this chapel in more detail. Very important, it's the Sistine Chapel and not the 16th Chapel. But here you can see this is a figure from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and he's leaning back. So what's really hard, Michelangelo, the artist here, is showing off because it's a curved ceiling, and yet he's able to make it look like this figure's kind of falling back into the background. All right, so let's think about how, going back to Giorgio de Chirico, how this was able to work. Here I can move myself up a bit. So with Giorgio de Chirico, we are seeing something that isn't quite one-point perspective. One-point perspective is what we would call linear or scientific or one-point perspective. This idea that you have a single vanishing point. You can also have two-point perspective, so we'll get to that in just a second. But essentially, you're using a system where all the orthogonals meet in a logical way, meet into a single point if it's one-point perspective. And this was a belief and a system that was codified in Italy, but it also seems to have come from the Middle East. It also seems to have been known in the ancient world. So, but there was in the early 15th century, this understanding and kind of writing down of how to create this system. So we'll go over that system here. But anyways, you can see these orthogonals or these diagonals meet in a single vanishing point. And in Europe, this was seen, and in the Western world and in other cultures in some cases, this was seen as a way of logically representing space. And some people felt like it seemed you could walk into a painting. It looked so real. Obviously, Giorgio de Chirico is playing, though, with one-point perspective here. Nothing aligns quite right, and this is creating that feeling of kind of nervous energy and this idea of surreal. This is the surrealist style, and thinking about more of an understanding of kind of psychological realities that people are thinking about, and an awareness of psychology that was also new in the 20th century. So this is not a proper one-point perspective, but Giorgio de Chirico is doing that on purpose. Any kind of perspective is this illusion of depth on a flat picture plane, and different cultures had different ways of doing this, but one-point perspective becomes very, very popular. This is just a diagram of one-point perspective that's a little bit clearer. So C is the vanishing point. You have these orthogonals that all recede into a single point, and you have what are called transversals that go across, that get gradually closer and closer together as you get back to C. And maybe in a class, a drawing class or some kind of class that you've taken in the past, you were asked to do a perspectival study, and you might have gone and seen buildings that recede into a vanishing point. Here I'm showing you an example of a painting called The Tribute Money. It's in a chapel called the Brancacci Chapel in Florence. It dates to 1427. In this one, we see one-point perspective because we can follow some of the orthogonals or diagonals from the building, and the vanishing point lands just above Jesus's head. We also have a technique called atmospheric or aerial perspective. And that's the idea that as you move back into space and you look at the landscape, it becomes kind of gray or blue and hazy as you move back. And you can see this if you go into the mountains. Sometimes as you gaze into the distance, you get a bit of that sense. In this particular case, this is the story of the tribute money, where a tax collector comes to Jesus and his followers and demands that the taxes be paid. Jesus's followers, especially Peter, are very upset, but Peter is commanded to go retrieve a coin from the mouth of a fish. So here you see Peter with his little spindly legs. And then Peter comes and presses the coin into the hand of the tax collector. I can just move myself down. So you can see the use of chiaroscuro, this kind of play of light and dark. So a lot of the things we've already talked about today can also be seen here. The artist also included shadows. So Masaccio included shadows here. And one point perspective is a nice way of figuring out who is the most important person. Usually you would have the vanishing point in an important part in the painting. Leonardo also used atmospheric or aerial perspective. So here is a full definition referring to light, bleached out, fuzzy handling of distant forms. So you can just see that kind of light background here, this dramatic difference that Leonardo creates between the foreground, middle ground, and then into the background. And I wanted to just give you a sense of how this might have developed. So this is a small city in Italy called Urbino, and you can see that in the foreground you have this kind of bright clarity, but in the background you can see this move towards this bluish or kind of grayish, hazy background. So you can really get the sense of how artists observed this in nature and then applied it into their paintings. You can also see how, depending on where you were located, as we've already discussed, there were different ways of handling space. So in Italy, around 1400, you have one-point perspective being used. But in the north, in the area of Flanders, the Netherlands, France, you have a more observed type of perspective, what was called empirical perspective. And so the forms are a bit more tipped so that you can see more details. It seems to all... like the back seems a little bit too small for the space, but there's an incredible amount of visual detail here. So Giorgio de Chirico's would technically be called a multi-point perspective, this idea that you could have a point here, you could draw a point here. You can use, it's kind of fun sometimes to just use the lines on your computer, to use a ruler, to use different tools that you might have. In the old days, people would use string to try to figure out the vanishing point, essentially. What was the so I've been using the term surrealism. So let's define surrealism. So surrealism contains bizarre arrangements of images or materials and taps the workings of the unconscious mind. And so here we can just see that idea of surrealism, especially like this figure here. Some people say, oh, is this a menacing figure in the background? Is it a sculpture, but it just looks like a menacing figure? And then you have this young girl playing with a hoop who's moving through the street. What's going on with this trailer here that's just empty? You have this dramatic difference between deep shadow and then kind of overexposed brightness on the other side. Another term we could apply here is what's called asymmetrical balance. So this idea that you have balance, like each building is balancing out the other side. You have the shadow balanced out with the light as well. But this idea that it's not symmetrical, there's no bilateral symmetry. It's not the same on each side. Instead, you just have this balancing of the composition. We can also have what's called radial balance. So this idea of elements in a composition visually radiating outward from a central point. And here we're looking at the grand and very large temple complex in Cambodia known as Angkor Wat. And Angkor Wat is, again, this massive complex that is associated with Hinduism, but also has associations with Buddhism too. It's about 1,000 years old. And it has connections to like a recreation of a mountain, like a very significant mountain. You can see this large central area here with four additional towers along the outside. And this is considered the most important of the surviving temple complexes in Cambodia. You can see that it moves from that central symbolic mountain out to these other sections, and there's huge areas of sculpture, relief sculpture, all along these corridors. All right, moving on to scale. So the size of something in relation to what we assume is normal. So the example I always use is Robert Therrien under the table. So Robert Therrien used these oversized tables, oversized furniture to play with our expectations, and they were very popular, and then they've become very popular again. There's one at the Broad Museum that people love to go and see. It's kind of this idea of returning to childhood, or again, experiencing everyday objects in a way that you didn't expect. So here I am at the Broad Museum, just to give you a sense of scale. This is an older photo now, but again, it just kind of plays with your expectations in an unusual way. So the way that artists can play with scale can be fun. This is the Chiat building. This is the binocular entrance. This is in Venice, California. So again, the scale of something in relation to what we assume to be normal. So it's these oversized binoculars, and it's a way of going into the garage of this building. And it's funny because I've walked by this building a lot of times, and it's something where when you're just walking along the street here, you don't even realize that you have these oversized binoculars as an entrance. So here I am in front of it. Over here, this is a while ago again. But if you're walking here, it just looks like kind of a very sculptural entrance to a building. But as you go across the street, you get the sense that it's these oversized binoculars. Claes Oldenburg was very interested in these kind of unexpected ways of enlarging smaller things. He would make essentially soft sculptures too, so things that weren't normally soft, he would make them soft. So he's very playful and would have these unusual approaches to sculpture. So here you can see he's using that in architecture. He's working with two very important figures in architecture. All right, hieratic scale. So the size of figures reflects importance. So some people say hieratic scale or hierarchy of scale, just the idea that the biggest figures in a sculpture are the most important. And so it's communicating importance by their size. So here I'm showing you a work by the artist Cimabue. This is his Madonna Enthroned from 1280. This is again from Italy. And you can see that you have a Virgin Mary who's very, very large, and she's holding the Christ child who is smaller than she is, but still very significant, right? It's really directing your attention to these two key figures who are surrounded by angels, Old Testament prophets down at the bottom, and essentially everything's directing your attention to them, and including the scale. We also have what's called proportion. So proportion is the size of one part in relation to another within a work of art. So we have with some cultures the idea of ideal proportion or systems or canon of proportion. So for example, in Greece, we have certain sculptures that are considered the canon or kind of establish the perfect body for a particular period in art. So for example, in this case, you have a head that would fit into the body 7 times, and that was considered an ideal set of proportion. Later on, there's an ideal about 1 century later, where the head would fit in the body 8 times. So it's a smaller head than this head. So just this idea that proportion, expectations, and style can change over time. Another very famous canon of proportions for individuals who were higher status was in Egypt. So this idea of showing a body with the head in profile, shoulders frontal, hips more in profile, and legs. But this kind of composite view with the shoulders and hips having a particular relation to one another or proportion to one another. This is very typical of Egypt and was especially used for high status individuals. So you can see more of that composite view here and a bit less of it here for the figures who are identified more as the servants of this individual. All right, and so for our exercise for this lecture is to look at some paintings and to try to apply some of the terms that we've used so far in this lecture. So thinking about line, light and value, so things like shading, modeling, chiaroscuro, formal elements, so the different elements of form, the color, the hue, the texture and pattern, shape and volume, space, perspective, aerial perspective, 1 point, scientific or linear perspective, balance, symmetry, proportion, scale, and hieratic scale. So hopefully this lecture has given you a better sense of some of these terms. I know it's a lot of terms, so try to take your time, and I think you'll find that as the semester goes on, you'll become much more comfortable using some of these terms. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the architecture one in just a little bit.